Don't move! Step away from the vehicle!
What? Officer, this is my house.
Turn around right now. Hands where I can see them.
I haven't done anything.
You match the description. Don't make this worse.
You're making a serious mistake.
That exchange didn't happen in a back alley. It didn't happen during a traffic stop on a dark highway. It happened on a quiet, tree-lined suburban street outside Washington, D.C., on a crisp Tuesday morning, in a woman's own driveway, captured in high definition on 4 separate cameras. The woman speaking those words wasn't a suspect. She wasn't a person of interest. She was Victoria Ames, a 41-year-old U.S. federal attorney who had spent the last 15 years arguing constitutional law at the highest levels of the American justice system. And on this particular Tuesday, all she was trying to do was load her luggage into her silver SUV and catch a 7:45 a.m. flight to New York, where she was scheduled to argue a landmark civil rights case before the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. She never made that flight. Instead, the woman who had devoted her entire career to defending the Constitution found herself standing in handcuffs on her own concrete driveway, watching a police officer rifle through her briefcase, a briefcase containing sealed federal documents, without a warrant, without consent, and without a single coherent legal justification, because someone in the neighborhood had called in a tip about a suspicious woman loading bags into a car, in her own driveway, in her own home. What Officer Jason Crowley did not know, or perhaps did not care about, in those first arrogant minutes, was that every single second of what he was doing was being recorded. His own body camera, a neighbor's Ring doorbell directly across the street, a retired civil rights attorney standing on her front porch with her phone held steady, and a passing jogger who stopped, pulled out her phone, and didn't move until the squad cars left. What Crowley also did not know was that the moment his partner scanned Victoria's DOJ credentials in the field system, an automated alert fired straight to the Department of Justice duty officer on call in Washington. The clock had already started, and it would not stop until 2 police officers lost their badges, their freedom, and every illusion they had ever held about operating above the law. This is the story of what happens when the system comes for the woman who built the system, and she fights back with the only weapon she has ever needed. If you believe in accountability, if you believe the law must protect everyone equally, and if stories like this one need to be told, hit that like button right now, drop a comment below telling us what you think about what you just heard, share this with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe so you never miss a story that matters. Because this one is only just beginning. Victoria Ames had been awake since 5 that morning. She had reviewed her case notes over coffee, ironed her court blazer the night before, and set 2 alarms just to be safe. By 6:45, she was dressed, focused, and moving, with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had never once been late to a courtroom in 15 years of federal practice. She wheeled her suitcase through the front door, set her leather briefcase on the driveway beside the rear of her silver SUV, and lifted the trunk. The neighborhood was still. A few birds. The distant sound of a sprinkler 2 houses down. The kind of morning that asks nothing of you. She never heard the squad car until it was already in her driveway. Officer Jason Crowley stepped out slowly, one hand resting on his belt, eyes moving across Victoria, across her luggage, across her vehicle, with the particular brand of lazy suspicion that comes not from training, but from habit. He had received a call 12 minutes earlier. Anonymous tip. Suspicious female, loading items into a vehicle on Sycamore Lane. He had not asked a single follow-up question before responding. Victoria turned, read the situation in under 2 seconds, and spoke first. "Good morning, officer. Can I help you?" Crowley asked for her ID. She didn't reach for a driver's license. She reached into the front pocket of her briefcase and produced her Department of Justice federal attorney credentials, the kind that carry a federal seal, a photograph, and a case classification number that can be verified in under 60 seconds by any law enforcement terminal in the country. She held them out. He looked at them. Not long, not carefully. He handed them back. "I'm going to need you to open the trunk for me, ma'am." Victoria looked at him steadily. "Do you have a warrant? I'm asking you to cooperate. I am a federal attorney. That is my vehicle, this is my home. And you have presented no warrant and no probable cause. I will not be opening my trunk." What happened next took less than 3 seconds. Crowley stepped forward, reached out, and closed his hand around Victoria Ames' arm. Not as a request, not as a warning, as a decision he had already made before he ever got out of the car. Victoria did not scream. She did not pull away. She stood perfectly still and said, in a voice so calm it was almost frightening, "You are making a very serious mistake, officer." Crowley didn't answer. Across the street, a porch light came on. Crowley pulled her arm behind her back with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had done it 1,000 times and never once stopped to ask whether he should. The handcuffs clicked into place on Victoria Ames' wrists at 6:53 in the morning, on her own driveway, in front of her own home, while her trunk stood open and her flight to New York counted down without her. Failure to comply, Crowley said, to no one in particular. As if saying it out loud made it real. As if the words were a legal argument rather than a performance. His partner, Officer Dale Pritch, 26 years old and 14 months on the force, stepped out of the passenger side and moved toward the vehicle without a word. He was younger, quieter, and visibly less certain than Crowley, but he moved anyway. He pulled open the rear door first, looked across the back seat, then turned his attention to the briefcase Victoria had set beside the trunk. He unclasped it and began to go through it. Inside that briefcase were sealed federal case documents, witness statements, privileged legal correspondence, materials that carried federal confidentiality protections that Pritch did not have the authority, the warrant, or the jurisdiction to touch. He touched them anyway. Victoria watched him from where she stood, hands pinned behind her back, and she did not cry. She did not beg. She did not raise her voice. Instead, she began to speak in a clear, unhurried tone that cut straight through the morning quiet like a blade. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. Crowley told her to stop talking. She continued. And no warrants shall issue, but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. Ma'am, I said stop. The Fourth Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, Victoria said, her voice never climbing above a conversational register, which you have now violated twice in the last 90 seconds. Pritch paused over the briefcase for just a moment. Something moved across his face, quick and uncomfortable, like a man who has just realized he has walked into something far larger than he was told. He looked at Crowley. Crowley looked away. The porch light across the street was still on, and now there was someone standing under it, phone raised, pointed directly at the driveway. The recording had already begun. Margaret Holloway was 71 years old, and she had spent 34 of those years as a civil rights attorney before her retirement. She had argued cases in federal court, testified before Senate subcommittees, and trained a generation of young lawyers in the precise language of constitutional protection. She did not miss much, and she had been watching from her living room window since the moment the squad car rolled into Victoria's driveway. She gave it 2 minutes, long enough to be certain of what she was seeing. Then she picked up her phone, activated the camera, walked through her front door, and stepped onto her porch. Her voice carried the full length of the street. That woman has identified herself as a federal officer. You have no warrant. What you are doing right now is an unlawful detention and an illegal search, and every second of it is being recorded. Crowley turned and looked at her with the expression of a man who was accustomed to being the loudest authority in any space he occupied. Ma'am, please go back inside. Margaret Holloway did not move a single inch. I am a retired civil rights attorney, and I am standing on my own property. You do not have the authority to instruct me to do anything. I am a witness to what is happening here, and I am documenting it. By the time she finished that sentence, a light had come on 2 houses to the left. David Okafor, a 38-year-old software engineer who coached his daughter's weekend soccer team, stepped out onto his front steps in a sweatshirt and running shoes, phone already up and recording. 30 seconds behind him, from the house on the opposite corner, came Patricia Suarez, still in her robe, who had been alerted by the voices and had the presence of mind to open her video app before she even reached her front door. 3 neighbors. 3 phones, all recording from different angles. Combined with the wide-angle Ring doorbell mounted above Margaret's own front door, which had been running continuously since the squad car first pulled in, there were now 4 independent devices capturing every movement, every word, and every decision being made in Victoria Ames's driveway. Crowley looked across the street at the phones, then back at Victoria, still standing in handcuffs beside her open trunk, her posture unbowed, her expression unreadable. He had come to this driveway expecting a routine call. What he had instead was a federal attorney in restraints, sealed government documents scattered across the interior of an illegally searched vehicle, and 4 cameras that never blinked. The morning had become something else entirely. 20 minutes had passed. 20 minutes of Victoria Ames standing in her own driveway, with her hands bound behind her back, while the morning light climbed higher and her flight to New York departed without her. 20 minutes of Margaret Holloway holding her phone steady from across the street. 20 minutes of Pritch avoiding eye contact with anyone, and Crowley performing the posture of a man who had done nothing wrong. Then the radio crackled. It was not a gentle sound. It cut through the quiet of the street with the sharp, flat authority of someone who was not calling to check in. Crowley, stand down. Right now. Release her. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Gerald Marsh, who had been pulled out of a department briefing 7 minutes earlier by a phone call from the DOJ duty officer on call in Washington. That call had been triggered automatically the moment Pritch ran Victoria's credentials through the field system. The system had flagged the ID, cross-referenced her federal classification, and sent an alert up the chain before either officer had finished searching her briefcase. By the time Marsh got on the radio, the DOJ already had the incident number, the location, the timestamp, and the names of both officers. The clock, as it turned out, had been running against Crowley from the moment he touched her arm. Crowley stood very still for a moment, radio in hand, with the particular stillness of a man whose certainty has just drained out through the soles of his boots. Then he walked to Victoria, reached behind her, and removed the handcuffs without a word. No apology, no explanation. He clipped the cuffs back onto his belt, walked to his squad car, got in, and drove away. Pritch followed, eyes forward, jaw set, not looking at anyone on either side of the street. Victoria stood on her driveway and watched them go. Then she crouched down, gathered the sealed documents that had been removed from her briefcase, placed them back with careful, deliberate hands, and closed the clasp. She picked up the briefcase. She stood up straight. She took one long breath, and then she called her attorney. She did not call her husband first. She did not call a friend. She did not sit down on her front steps and let the weight of what had just happened press her into the concrete. She made the call she had been trained her entire career to make when the law was broken. Her attorney answered on the second ring. "I need you to start a file," Victoria said quietly. "They just made the biggest mistake of their careers." Margaret Holloway posted the footage at 9 o'clock in the morning with a single sentence of caption. No hashtags, no commentary, just the video and the words. "This happened this morning, 2 houses from my front door." The woman in handcuffs is a United States federal attorney. By 9:45, it had been shared 4,000 times. By 10:30, it was on the front page of every major news website in the country. By noon, 10 million people had watched Officer Jason Crowley dismiss a federal attorney's credentials, grab her arm, place her in handcuffs on her own driveway, and drive away without a single word of explanation or apology. They watched it on their phones during lunch breaks. They watched it on their laptops in office cubicles. They watched it on televisions, in barbershops and hair salons and college common rooms, in silence, and then not in silence. By midnight, 30 million. The hashtags came fast, and they came hard. They trended nationally within the first hour and internationally before sundown. Victoria's name was spoken on the floor of the House of Representatives before the afternoon session ended. 3 senators issued formal statements demanding an immediate federal investigation. A 4th called for the officers to be suspended pending review. A 5th called for something considerably stronger than suspension. The DOJ announced a formal civil rights inquiry at 4:17 in the afternoon. The statement was 7 sentences long and used the word serious twice. At 5 o'clock, the police chief held a press conference. He stood behind a podium with the department seal, flanked by 2 deputy commissioners, and spoke for 11 minutes about the department's commitment to community trust, ongoing officer training, and the complexity of split-second decision-making in the field. He used the phrase isolated incident in the 4th minute. He used it again in the 9th. The clip of him saying it the 2nd time was viewed 8 million times before midnight. The comments did not go well for him. What the police chief did not mention at his press conference was that by the time he stepped behind that podium, the DOJ had already contacted the department's Internal Affairs Division. The FBI Civil Rights Division had already made 3 phone calls. And Victoria Ames's attorney had already filed the first round of formal legal documents. Each one precise, each one devastating, each one building the foundation of a case that would not be settled quietly and would not be going away. The police chief called it an isolated incident. 30 million people who had watched the footage with their own eyes had already decided otherwise. Dale Pritch had not slept properly in 6 days. He had gone through the motions, shown up for his shift, answered questions from his union rep in short, careful sentences, eaten meals he could not taste, and sat through evenings in his apartment staring at a television he was not watching. He was 26 years old and he had 14 months on the force, and he had spent every one of those 6 sleepless nights replaying the same 90 seconds in his driveway over and over until they were worn smooth as riverstone. He had not wanted to search that briefcase. He knew that now with a clarity that came too late to matter. He had known it then too, in the quiet, honest part of himself that he had overridden, because Crowley was the senior officer, and Crowley had moved with such absolute certainty, and it had seemed, in that moment, easier to follow than to stop. That was the part that kept him awake, not what Crowley had done, what he himself had chosen to do. On the 7th morning, he picked up his phone and called the DOJ Inspector General's office, before he had time to talk himself out of it. The call lasted 2 hours. He told them everything. The remark Crowley made in the car before they pulled in. The way Crowley had looked at Victoria's credentials and handed them back without really reading them. The moment Pritch had opened that briefcase and felt something cold and certain settle in his chest. He told them about the form Crowley had asked him to sign afterward, an incident report that described Victoria as uncooperative and combative, that made no mention of her credentials, and that Crowley had already half filled out before they were back at the precinct. Pritch had signed it. That was the thing he could not get past. He had signed it and gone home and tried to sleep, and failed for 6 consecutive nights. He told the investigators all of it. In exchange for his full cooperation and testimony, he was offered immunity from the most serious charges. He accepted without hesitation. When Victoria's attorney was notified that Pritch had flipped, she set down her coffee cup, looked at the wall for a moment, and then wrote 3 words at the top of a fresh legal pad. They have nothing, because that was what Pritch's testimony meant. It meant Crowley had no defense, that the prosecution could not dismantle piece by piece, using the words of the man who had been standing right beside him. The trial date was set for the following spring. The federal courtroom was standing room only on the first morning of trial, and it stayed that way for every day that followed. Crowley's defense attorney was a former prosecutor named Harlan Briggs, who had spent 20 years on the other side of courtrooms exactly like this one, and knew how to construct a narrative from the wreckage of bad facts. He had done it before. He intended to do it again. His strategy was straightforward and familiar: reasonable officer, split-second decision, an honest mistake made under pressure by a 12-year veteran with a clean departmental record. A record that appeared clean only because 3 complaints had been buried by a precinct captain who was now the subject of his own separate federal inquiry. Briggs knew the videos were a problem. He knew Pritch was a catastrophe. What he had left was tone, and doubt, and the hope that somewhere in the jury box there was someone he could reach. He did not reach anyone. The prosecution opened by playing all 4 videos simultaneously on a split screen, synchronized to the same timestamp, so that the jury could watch the same 90 seconds from 4 different angles at the same time. They watched Victoria present her credentials. They watched Crowley hand them back. They watched him grab her arm. They watched Pritch open the briefcase. They watched Margaret Holloway step onto her porch. They watched Crowley drive away without a word. Then they played the 12 recovered seconds. The courtroom was absolutely silent when it ended. Victoria Ames took the stand on the 4th day. She had dressed carefully, a dark navy suit, her DOJ credentials on the table in front of her, her hands folded and still. She answered every question in the same unhurried, precise register she had used in her own driveway. She walked the jury through each constitutional violation in sequence, citing the specific statute, the specific moment in the footage, and the specific legal standard that Crowley had failed to meet. She did not perform outrage. She did not ask for sympathy. She simply laid out the law, brick by brick, until the structure of what had been done to her was so clear and so complete that there was no remaining angle from which it could be mistaken for anything other than what it was. Briggs cross-examined her for 2 hours. She did not waver once. When she stepped down from the stand, 3 jurors were visibly emotional. Briggs looked at his notepad for a long time without writing anything. The jury began deliberating on a Thursday morning. They returned their verdict before dinner. Guilty, on every count. The foreperson read the verdict in a steady voice, and the courtroom received it in a silence that lasted exactly 3 seconds before it broke open completely. Crowley sat at the defense table with his hands flat on the surface in front of him, and his face arranged into an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and not quite succeeding. Briggs put a hand on his arm and said something quietly. Crowley did not respond. The sentencing hearing came 6 weeks later. The judge was a woman who had been on the federal bench for 19 years, and was not known for lengthy speeches from the bench. She sentenced Jason Crowley to 4 years in federal prison for civil rights violations under color of law, obstruction of justice, and filing a false official report. She noted in her remarks that the false report was not an afterthought. It was a deliberate attempt to rewrite the constitutional record of what had occurred, and that it represented a profound betrayal of the oath Crowley had taken and the authority the public had extended to him. Pritch received a suspended sentence, mandatory retraining, and 2 years of supervised probation. The precinct captain who had buried 3 complaints over 6 years was separately charged and reached a plea agreement that ended his career in law enforcement permanently. The civil settlement came 30 days after sentencing, $4.2 million. But the money, significant as it was not the part that mattered most to Victoria. What mattered were the conditions attached to it: mandatory body camera activation protocols that could not be overridden by individual officers, a complete overhaul of the department's bias training curriculum, the establishment of an independent civilian oversight board with real investigative authority and no departmental interference, and a formal review process for every previously dismissed complaint in the department's files going back 10 years. Victoria issued one public statement. It was 4 sentences long. She thanked the witnesses who had stood on their porches and held their phones steady. She thanked Dale Pritch for finding the courage to tell the truth. She said the Constitution was only as strong as the people willing to defend it. And she announced the founding of the Ames Constitutional Defense Fund, a free legal defense network for any citizen facing unlawful law enforcement action anywhere in the country. The fund received 200 case inquiries in its first 30 days. Victoria Ames went back to work. She had a flight to catch, a courtroom to walk into, and a constitution worth defending. She had never needed anyone to tell her that. 6 months after the morning she never made her flight, Victoria Ames stood before the Second Circuit Court of Appeals in New York and argued the landmark civil rights case she had originally been traveling to present. She was 12 minutes early. Her briefcase was organized. Her credentials were in her jacket pocket, exactly where they always were. She won the case unanimously. There is a version of this story that ends on the driveway. That lets the handcuffs be the final image, the lasting weight. There are thousands of stories that end exactly there, in the moment of humiliation. Because no camera stayed on long enough, no neighbor stepped outside, no federal alert fired through the right system at the right time. Victoria Ames knew that. She had built a career on the knowledge of how many stories end before justice enters the frame. That knowledge was precisely why she refused to let hers be only about her. The Ames Constitutional Defense Fund did not take on easy cases. It took on the cases that looked like hers before anyone was watching. The routine stop that went wrong in a city with no Margaret Holloway across the street. The detainment that produced no viral footage, no congressional statement, no FBI inquiry. The person who filed a complaint and received a form letter and was told, in the language of bureaucratic indifference, that the matter had been reviewed and resolved. Victoria reviewed every intake personally. Every single one. Margaret Holloway joined the fund's advisory board in its second month and brought 2 former colleagues with her. Andre Simmons, the schoolteacher who had waited 18 months for someone to ask the right questions, became the fund's first community liaison in his city. Dale Pritch, having completed his retraining and his probation, applied for a position with a police accountability nonprofit in the same city where he had once stood in a driveway and made a choice he could not live with. He was hired. He showed up early on his first day. The driveway on Sycamore Lane looked exactly as it always had. Quiet street, mature trees, the kind of neighborhood that asks nothing of you on an ordinary morning. Victoria drove past it every day. She never stopped thinking about what it had cost her to stand there in handcuffs, composed and unbroken, reciting the words of a document that was supposed to protect everyone equally. She never stopped believing that it would. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below. Subscribe so you never miss a story that matters. Because accountability does not begin in a courtroom. It begins the moment someone decides to keep watching and refuses to look away.